The first thing that felt wrong wasn't the truck. It was the silence. Every weekday morning for nearly 6 years, I could count on hearing the same little routine outside my kitchen window before I'd even finished pouring my coffee. Kids laughing, somebody yelling, "Wait up," a crossing guard blowing her whistle, and the occasional impatient driver pretending not to see the bright orange stop paddle. It wasn't exciting, but that's kind of the point. When something becomes part of your daily life, you stop noticing it until one morning it's gone. March 18th, 2023, 7:41 a.m. I remember the time because my coffee maker had just beeped when I glanced out the window and noticed a white heavy-duty pickup sitting unusually still at the intersection. Two men wearing reflective safety vests stood beside it, heads bent over a clipboard, pointing toward the school crosswalk like they were measuring something. They weren't city workers I recognized, and around here you eventually learn every face. I watched them for another minute before my eyes drifted toward the corner where Mrs. Ness, Eleanor Briggs, usually stood every single morning. 70 years old, silver hair tucked under a baseball cap, bright orange vest, 2 sizes too big. She'd wave every kid across that street like each one was her own grandchild. But that morning, the corner was empty. The children were already gathering with backpacks almost bigger than they were, looking around with that confused expression kids get when the adults suddenly stop following the rules they're always preaching. One little boy stepped off the curb before jerking backward as an SUV rolled through without slowing down. My stomach tightened. "Where's Mrs. Briggs?" I muttered to myself. At first I figured she'd called in sick. People get sick. Life happens. But by lunchtime, my neighbor Lisa forwarded an email she'd somehow gotten from the Willow Creek Community Association. Funny thing was, I didn't even live inside Willow Creek. My property sat just outside the subdivision, across the public road, which meant their rules had exactly zero authority over me. Still, the email caught my attention. It read, in the driest corporate language imaginable, that the board had voted to temporarily suspend funding for the crossing guard position as part of a broader effort to eliminate unnecessary operational expenses. Unnecessary. I read that word 3 times. Apparently making sure elementary school kids crossed a busy road safely had become an unnecessary expense. I actually laughed. One of those laughs people make when they're too irritated to yell. My wife, Karen, looked over from the dining room and asked what was funny. I handed her my phone. She read it, frowned, then looked out the window toward the school. "That doesn't even make sense," she said. "Isn't that a city crossing?" "Exactly," I answered, which makes me wonder why the HOA thinks they can eliminate it. That question sat in the back of my head all weekend, and honestly I probably would have let it go if Monday morning hadn't brought something completely different. Around 8:15, the windows rattled hard enough to shake the dishes in the cabinet. I walked outside thinking maybe somebody had lost control of a dump truck. Turns out, I wasn't far off. One giant gravel truck thundered past my driveway. Then another. Then another. They weren't delivering to anyone in the neighborhood. They were heading toward a construction site somewhere beyond the subdivision. By noon, I'd counted 14 of them. Each one rolled directly through the school crossing, right during morning arrival. The timing bothered me more than the trucks themselves. I called the city's traffic department expecting a simple explanation. Maybe there'd been a detour. Maybe a bridge somewhere had closed. Instead, the man who answered sounded surprised by my question. "Those trucks should be following the approved access route through Willow Creek Boulevard," he explained after pulling up the permit. "That's exactly where they are," I replied. "They're passing the elementary school." He paused. "That shouldn't create a pedestrian issue, according to the supporting documents." His voice faded while he kept reading. "Supporting documents from who?" I asked. Another pause. Longer this time. "Community Association representative." "That's interesting," I said slowly, "because I don't belong to that association, and neither does this road." There was enough silence on the other end that I thought we'd been disconnected. Finally, he cleared his throat and quietly said, "If that's accurate, someone may have represented authority they didn't actually have." That sentence stayed with me all afternoon. Not because it proved anything. It didn't. But because it planted a seed I couldn't ignore. Something wasn't adding up. Cutting the crossing guard suddenly wasn't just about saving a little money. The timing was too convenient. The trucks showed up almost immediately afterward, and somehow an HOA that didn't own the road had managed to influence a public traffic decision. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe it wasn't. I've always believed coincidence deserves exactly one chance. After that, you start digging. By sunset, I grabbed my flashlight, slipped on an old jacket, and walked down to the intersection, telling Karen I'd be back in 20 minutes. I had no idea that little evening walk was about to drag me into the biggest fight our town had seen in years. And before it was over, a handful of signatures on a piece of paper would cost some very important people far more than they ever imagined. The next morning, I skipped my usual workout, threw a notebook into my truck, and drove straight to City Hall before most people had even finished breakfast. I've never considered myself some kind of investigator. I'm just the type of guy who can't let something go once it stops making sense. My father used to tell me, if somebody gets nervous when you ask a simple question, you're probably asking the right question. I kept hearing his voice as I walked into the planning and development office. The woman behind the counter smiled politely until I asked to see the routing amendment connected to the new construction project outside Willow Creek. Her smile faded just enough for me to notice. That might take a little while, she said. That's okay, I answered. I've got all day. 3 hours later, I was sitting at a scratched metal table flipping through permit folders thick enough to stop a bullet. Most of it was boring engineering language. Drainage reports, traffic estimates, utility maps. But buried inside one amendment dated exactly 2 weeks before Mrs. Briggs disappeared from that crosswalk was something that made every hair on my arm stand up. Attached to the city's approval packet was a support letter from the Willow Creek Community Association stating there were no significant pedestrian conflicts along the proposed truck route during construction hours. I read that sentence again, then again. No significant pedestrian conflicts. They were talking about a road with an elementary school sitting less than 200 feet away. Hundreds of children crossed there every weekday morning. Either whoever wrote that letter had never visited the intersection, or they were counting on nobody else visiting the paperwork. Then I saw the signature. It wasn't the city engineer. It wasn't the mayor. It was the HOA treasurer, Randall Pierce. I'd met Randall exactly twice. Both times he'd introduced himself like he owned half the county because he'd once managed a regional bank. Expensive watch, polished boots, smile that never reached his eyes. The kind of man who enjoyed reminding people which committee he chaired before telling them what they couldn't do. I made copies of every page they legally allowed me to copy, highlighted the amendment date with a blue marker, thanked the clerk for her patience, and headed home with the uneasy feeling that I'd just stumbled onto something much bigger than a missing crossing guard. Karen was waiting in the driveway when I pulled in. You look like you saw a ghost, she said. I spread the papers across the kitchen table. She read quietly for several minutes before looking up. They actually signed this? Looks that way. Can they do that? That's what I'm about to find out. Instead of calling a lawyer first, I called someone else. My old friend Mark Benson. Mark had spent 25 years working for the county transportation department before retiring. He knew permits, traffic studies, liability rules, all the boring government stuff most people never think about. He listened while I explained everything, then interrupted me halfway through. Slow down, he said. Read me the exact wording. I did. He didn't say anything for several seconds. Finally, he exhaled. If that statement influenced the routing approval, and if they knowingly ignored the school crossing, another pause. That could expose everybody involved if something happened to a child. That sentence hit harder than I expected. Up until then, I'd been annoyed, maybe even angry. Suddenly, I wasn't thinking about politics anymore. I was thinking about what would have happened if that little boy I'd seen Monday morning had taken one more step into the street while one of those fully loaded gravel trucks came through. You can't rewind that kind of mistake. That night, I walked back to the intersection just before sunrise with a folding chair, a thermos of coffee, and my phone mounted on a small tripod. I wasn't there to confront anyone. I just wanted to watch. Between 7:15 and 8:20, I counted 19 heavy trucks. 19. Every single one passed directly through the school zone while children crossed with nothing but parents trying to wave traffic down themselves. Mrs. Donnelly, whose twin daughters were in second grade, nearly got clipped while pulling one child backward by her backpack. The truck driver leaned on his horn like she'd inconvenienced him. She stood frozen for a second before screaming, "Slow down. There are kids here." The driver shrugged through the windshield and kept rolling. I caught the whole thing on video. By Thursday, I'd recorded 3 mornings worth of footage. Parents started recognizing me sitting near the corner. Some brought coffee. Others stopped to vent. "Nobody asked us about removing the crossing guard," one father said. "The board keeps saying it's temporary," another mother added. But somehow the truck showed up the same week. An older gentleman named Walter shook his head and quietly muttered, "Temporary has a funny way of becoming permanent when money gets involved." The more people talked, the clearer the picture became. A new commercial development was going up behind Willow Creek, routing construction traffic through the subdivision's main boulevard shaved almost 15 minutes off every delivery. Less fuel, faster trips, bigger profits. But one little obstacle stood in the way. Children crossing the street every morning. Remove the crossing guard. Declare there was no pedestrian conflict. And suddenly the trucks could move almost uninterrupted. Maybe nobody sat around a conference table saying, "Let's risk children's lives." Real life usually isn't that dramatic. It's worse. People convince themselves that cutting one corner won't matter, then another, until someone eventually gets hurt. Friday afternoon, I attended the HOA board meeting even though I wasn't technically a member. Nobody stopped me from sitting quietly in the back. Randall Pierce spotted me almost immediately. I could tell by the look on his face he recognized me from years earlier when we'd argued over a drainage ditch along the property line. After the meeting ended, he walked over wearing that same polished smile. "Didn't realize you were interested in association business, Mr. Carter." "I'm interested when association business starts affecting public roads." His smile tightened. "Everything we've done complies with procedure." I reached into my folder and held up the routing amendment. "Including this?" For the first time since I'd met him, his expression cracked, just for a second. Barely noticeable, but it was there. He recovered quickly. "Those documents speak for themselves." "They sure do," I replied. "Especially the part where you certified there wasn't a pedestrian conflict." He folded his arms. "The city made the final decision. After reading your letter, take it up with them." Then he leaned slightly closer and lowered his voice. "You're making a bigger deal out of this than it deserves." I smiled back. "Maybe." I slid the papers back into my folder. "Or maybe it deserves more attention than it's gotten." As I turned to leave, he called after me, "Careful who you accuse, Daniel. People can end up regretting that." I stopped without looking back. "Funny thing about facts," I said. "They don't care who regrets them." By then, I'd already made up my mind. I wasn't going to spend months arguing in meeting rooms while trucks kept rolling past children every morning. If official paperwork had helped create this mess, public attention was going to clean it up. The following Monday, I drove to the newsroom carrying a folder thick with permits, photographs, traffic counts, and 3 mornings of video footage. And before I walked through those glass doors, I had no idea that one local reporter was about to turn a neighborhood dispute into the biggest story our county had seen in years. By Tuesday evening, the story had aired twice, once during the 6 o'clock news and again during the late broadcast. And somehow a neighborhood issue that most people would have ignored had suddenly become the topic everyone in town seemed to be talking about. The reporter didn't exaggerate anything. She didn't have to. She showed the videos exactly as they happened. Children hesitating at the curb, parents stepping into traffic to stop trucks with nothing but raised hands, 18-wheelers rumbling through the school zone while the empty corner where a crossing guard had stood for years sat quietly in the background like a missing piece everyone could finally see. Then the camera cut to the routing amendment, zooming in on the sentence that claimed there were no meaningful pedestrian conflicts. Watching it on television from my living room felt strange because I'd spent days staring at that same piece of paper. but seeing it broadcast to thousands of people gave it an entirely different weight. Karen looked over at me and simply whispered, "Now they can't pretend they didn't know." She was right. By sunrise the next morning, the city's phone lines were flooded. Parents demanded answers. Teachers started asking questions during school drop-off. Even people who had never cared much about HOA politics suddenly wanted to know why a private neighborhood board had been involved in decisions affecting a public road. Around 10 o'clock, my phone rang. It was the same traffic department employee I'd spoken with the week before. His voice sounded exhausted. "Mr. Carter, I thought you'd want to know we've issued an emergency suspension on the construction routing permit pending a full review." I leaned back in my chair without saying anything for a moment. Outside my office window, I noticed something I hadn't seen all week. Silence. No gravel trucks. No vibrating windows. Just birds. "Does that mean they're done using the road?" I finally asked. "For now, yes." Then he added something I'll probably never forget. "Sometimes paperwork tells one story until someone shows us what the paperwork left out." A week later, Mrs. Eleanor Briggs returned to the intersection wearing that familiar oversized orange vest, holding her stop paddle like she'd never left. The children cheered when they saw her. One little girl actually ran over and hugged her before school. Mrs. Briggs laughed, wiped away a tear, then looked over at me standing beside my truck. She smiled and gave me a tiny wave. We never needed a long conversation. We both understood what that moment meant. Safety had quietly returned to being ordinary again, exactly where it belonged. The city eventually launched an internal review into how the routing amendment had been approved. I won't pretend everyone responsible faced dramatic consequences because real life rarely wraps itself up that neatly. A few officials resigned from advisory committees. The association quietly hired outside legal counsel. Policies about public infrastructure comments were rewritten. Future traffic approvals required direct school district review before construction routes could be changed. Randall Pierce? I saw him once, several months later, leaving a grocery store. He recognized me immediately. We stood there for a second in the parking lot before he walked over. I expected another argument. Instead, he looked tired, older somehow. "You happy now?" he asked. I thought about it before answering because the honest response surprised even me. "No," I said. "I'd have been happier if none of this had ever been necessary." He nodded once, looked down at the pavement, and quietly walked away without another word. That was the last time we ever spoke. Looking back now, people sometimes ask why I kept pushing. Why spend days digging through records? Why deal with angry board members, television cameras, and all the stress that came with it? The answer is actually pretty simple. Because there are moments when staying quiet feels easier, but it costs everyone else a little more than it costs you. One signature on one letter almost convinced an entire city that children crossing a busy street simply didn't exist. If nobody had bothered asking questions, those trucks would have kept rolling, parents would have kept taking bigger risks every morning, and eventually luck would have run out. I don't think I'm some kind of hero. I'm just a guy who happened to look out his kitchen window at the right moment and decided not to look away. Maybe that's the lesson I've carried with me ever since. Communities don't fall apart all at once. They erode one small compromise at a time, one ignored concern at a time, one convenient shortcut at a time, until somebody finally says, "Wait a second, this isn't right." And sometimes that's enough to change everything. But here's the part I still think about. What if those trucks had never shown up during school hours? What if the timing had been just a little different? Would anyone have questioned that letter? Would anyone have noticed the crossing guard quietly disappearing? Or would everyone, including me, have accepted the explanation about budget cuts and moved on? That's the question I still don't have an answer to. And maybe that's exactly why stories like this matter. If you've made it this far, I'd really like to hear what you think. Was the HOA simply trying to save money and making a terrible mistake? Or do you believe someone knowingly put convenience and profit ahead of children's safety? And if you had discovered the same documents, would you have taken them to the media or handled it differently? Share your thoughts in the comments because these conversations matter more than people realize. If you enjoyed this true-to-life story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next story about ordinary people standing up when something just doesn't feel right. Until next time, take care of yourselves, take care of your neighbors, and never underestimate the power of one person asking one simple question.